Hi there. Today we'll be talking about World War II. This, along with the Civil War and the American Revolution, is one of the most written about stretches in American history, but it's also one of the areas of American history that sees the biggest gaps between the way the general public sees it and the way historians do. So welcome to the pros. If you want an example of the difference between historians and the general public, here's one. Historians don't tend to busy their little heads about whether the people who fought the Second World War were or were not any greater than any other generation of Americans. By this point in the semester, you probably know why. When historians say something, they want to be able to prove it with evidence. And how can you prove that one thing is greater than another? That all comes down to our morals or our ethics, not our analysis. On the other hand, historians are perfectly willing to consider how certain groups of people and certain time periods come to be imbued with certain values or narratives. You might well ask why our culture looks back on these people with reverence. What does it tell us about our own time, and what has changed from that time to ours? What historians are far more worried about is how things work, what their consequences are, and how they reveal or contradict wider patterns in the history of American democracy. And there, World War II justifies the attention paid to it. It was a moment when Americans, perceiving themselves threatened by an outside force, both attempted to define themselves and to experiment with new ideas, and ways of fitting those new ideas into existing definitions of themselves that they hoped would allow them to prevail. Some historians, especially during the early years of the Cold War, told this story in ways that emphasized how America's reigning institutions came together under the influence of war. In doing so, they followed Franklin Roosevelt's lead. He helped define America via its purported defense of the Four Freedoms, and some historians have argued that he essentially got things right. On a broad cultural level, these historians found Americans exemplifying their old ethic, or perhaps experimenting with a new ethic, of shared sacrifice, the kind you can perceive here in the bottom part of this poster. You might also perceive that some of that ethic was prodded into being by government. Obviously, if they had to make a poster telling you to share your rations and not be selfish, that means they might not have done it naturally. But of course, in a democracy, you can also argue that the government was performing the will of the people. You'll have occasion to examine and critique this notion in at least a few of our documents. Along the same lines, some historians also argued that that ethic of shared sacrifice in the name of a common cause characterized America's less personal institutions too. Some noted that the enormous rise in government power was not fought by, as it had been in the past, but in fact aided and abetted by business, as you can see in this poster, which links government, business management, and unions together in the same endeavor. Others observed that Republicans and Democrats collaborated on at least some parts of the war efforts. So I'll ask, was there something new at work here, perhaps in the way government operated, in following a sense of a moral or ideological purpose? Or was this all part of a longer history? You can perceive, for instance, government and business operating in tandem during the Gilded Age. Or did these historians merely buy what they were sold? As the 1960s developed into the 1970s, historians started to break apart this narrative of moral purpose and unified effort. Some noted the anti-Semitism that haunted the American war effort, and that helped keep America's government from opening its doors to Jewish and other refugees both before and after the war began, thus failing to save potentially hundreds of thousands of lives. Others noted the Roosevelt administration's decision to forcibly remove people of Japanese ancestry from their homes and businesses and keep them at what were at the time unambiguously called concentration camps. And still others wondered about how well Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, not to mention a war against a racist totalitarian regime, corresponded with the continued segregation of the armed forces and the government's continued funneling of military resources to segregated communities like, Fayetteville, North Carolina, and thereby essentially sanctioning and offering economic support to those communities. Indeed, World War II has caused some historians to question America's whole notion of its being a melting pot. You might ask whether the notion of fighting against Nazi racism, which helps define our memory of the war, actually appears in most contemporary propaganda or other documents. If not, does that suggest that the notion of a war for racial equality was a later grafting onto what actually happened? Historians have also dug into the history of the Manhattan Project, which created the atomic bomb, and asked whether its execution, which unfolded in absolute secrecy and without any sense of transparency, really corresponded with freedom of speech. You can see here Los Alamos, a completely secret community where, as you can see in the bottom corner, what people said and did was off limits for talking about outside. Historians have also asked whether what the Manhattan Project wrought, a new kind of weapon created with no democratic oversight, entirely secured freedom from fear. The important question, really, is what were America's and Americans' priorities, and why? If the war wasn't about saving people, if it wasn't a quote-unquote good war, what was it about? And if it was for freedom, as Roosevelt and others agreed, how does the Manhattan Project comport with that quest? I implore you to answer those questions based on evidence. In terms of actual strategy, most of the early debates among historians focused on America's relationship with the USSR, with scholars in the throes of the Cold War wondering both whether allying itself with the totalitarian regime compromised America's ideals and, more forcefully, whether America finessed that relationship well enough. The other question that has gained steam more recently is whether America's use of the atomic bomb, and a second atomic bomb especially, was either justified or useful. I leave that enormously vexed question to you, but I hope again that you'll consider evidence before answering it.